A common pattern in each of the big three is how they establish a deeply emotional hook for the primary protagonist to allow us to lock in on the character. In Chapter 1 of One Piece, we see Luffy's immense yearning for freedom and his dream of becoming the Pirate King, and how it is so impacted by his love for Shanks and the latter's sacrifice to establish the promise between the two. In Naruto, we are confronted with Naruto's immense loneliness, the way he's been cast out, and how he nonetheless tries to connect with others and perseveres with what would seem like his impossible dream. Bleach likewise introduces Ichigo's immense characterization, but there are two key differences here. Firstly, we are not actually given the core reason for why he is the way he is right off the bat. The first chapter largely consists of his immense care for those he loves and his desire to do anything, including sacrificing himself, to protect them. But we don't actually really understand much about his place in the world, his motives, and his backstory in the way we do for Luffy and Naruto. That doesn't come until Memories in the Rain nearly 20 chapters later. Of course, Luffy and Naruto likewise are both expanded upon in numerous ways from what we learn about them in their introduction, but we get a core sense of the why from them immediately regardless. Whereas with Ichigo, a lot of what we surmise from him is through his actions rather than learning about him in a moment of respite. And the second difference here is that we don't actually learn about some sort of grand dream for Ichigo. Luffy wants to find the One Piece and become the Pirate King, Naruto wants to become the Hokage. Ichigo, both in the first chapter and the rest of the story, has no such tangible dream, no defined endpoint. He just wants to protect those he cares about from any danger, at any cost. He just wants to break the wheel of suffering, and this is instilled in him through such immense survivor's guilt and feelings of inadequacy after Masaki died protecting him. Ichigo will do anything to ensure that he isn't weak, and this is so that others will not be hurt due to him, so that he can compensate for what he views as his own faults by doing anything to shoulder burdens on his own to protect. These three protagonists are three of my favorite characters ever, and this difference isn't something that inherently makes them or Ichigo better, but the difference between their presentation style here is indicative of one of the reasons that Ichigo immediately caught my attention. In comparison to a lot of protagonists, Ichigo's primary goals are much more short-term while being incredibly self-destructive. With no regard for the value of his own life, he tosses his own well-being aside for the sake of others time and time again in the name of his idea of what it means to be strong. But once he achieves that, it's on to the next situation to sacrifice himself within. It's a never-ending crawl, shielding all those around him with a body and mind that slowly but surely diminish just a little bit every time. He's actually quite similar to Gon Freaks in the way that the latter consistently does anything he can to feel a sense of increasing strength to be worthy of his perception of his father, without realizing that this sort of tunnel vision will only lead him to ruin. It is clear from the start that Ichigo cannot go on living like this forever. It's unsustainable, and those around him know it, but they are likewise too caught up in their own trauma and psychological fragmenting to be able to do much to change it. In comparison to a lot of his contemporaries, Ichigo's journey is a much more undefinable one because he himself isn't aware of it at the start. Essentially, it's a path to understanding who he is and learning to love and value himself despite oftentimes actively working against that for the sake of short-term desperation. It's something I can relate to as someone who can be impulsive immediately after setbacks when the better option is to just take a breath and understand the big picture. And while Ichigo does reach that wisdom in the story, it's an ideal that is ever evolving and never properly achieved, as we humans are never in stasis. It's excruciatingly difficult to reach what Ichigo reaches, not achievable without immense maturation and experience and connections to guide you along the way. And that is why his arc is incredibly slow. Now, that undoubtedly bothers some and has drawn criticism, but personally I think for it to not have been approached slowly would have been a disservice to the sheer difficulty of what Ichigo is going through and how deeply rooted his trauma is. As a narrative progression, it's messy, it's gradual, and there are regressions to every progression. And the unveiling of who Ichigo is and his battle with learning to accept that and the implications of it is reflective of what it's like in life to learn to love oneself. Because of how viscerally I felt Ichigo's sense of loss and anxiety at every turn, because of how fervently he misses Masaki and how that haunts him, because of how clear it is that he's a gentle soul that loves all those around him so much, I couldn't help but buy in. He became my favorite character in the series immediately, and that never changed. Although my current immense Aizen brain rot may have something to say about that. But from early on, the foremost thought in my mind was that I just wanted Ichigo to be happy, to reach a feeling of peace and self-actualization and learn that his life is a blessing and a gift rather than something that he owes to others. I wanted him to realize what his mother wanted for him. And it was a slow, plodding journey, full of false ascents and many failures, very true to life. But in the end, we got there. And it was one of the greatest moments of payoff that I've experienced in any story. More than nearly anyone else in the story, Ichigo cares for others. He feels for them, he is empathetic, and while he may not be the most elaborate and expressive communicator verbally, he lays his soul bare through his fights and is always open to conversation via combat, which has actually led to so many of his combatants feeling a desire to change their course through seeing an alternate perspective. However, if you take this care from Ichigo and mix it with his lack of self-worth and his desperation to compensate to protect others due to his guilt about Masaki, it leads to a desperation largely dependent on results. And this causes incorrect assumptions, both in and outside of the universe, about his progress. Ichigo wins and wins in Soul Society, showing us false dawn after false dawn, but all the while communicating with such lost souls and helping them reach understandings of their own that they wouldn't have without him. And in Arrancar, Grimmjow and Ulquiorra show his flailing lack of strength, but also his inability to value himself and how detrimentally results-oriented he is, incapable of being able to see the underlying value to the process. Ichigo becomes monstrous and sad at what he has to become and how unrecognizable he must be to protect those he loves, and this shows that he still isn't strong enough even if he wins. The gap between who he is and what he must become to win must be smaller, maybe even indistinguishable, if he is to become the healthiest, strongest, most serene version of himself. And through contrast, I think he learns that vital fact here, in the wake of his victory against Ulquiorra. Then through accepting Tenza Zangetsu, with a silent conviction, Ichigo defeats Aizen, who himself thrashes about in search of himself. But something is off. There are so many false dawns and victories that actually set Ichigo back in terms of his progression, so many moments that feel like they could be self-actualization, like this transformation. But there are always tons of hints, overt and minor, that indicate that things are not yet complete. And in this instance, it is a hilariously rudimentary observation that I pointed out upon reading that indicated that Ichigo can't be self-actualized yet. Because aside from a lot of the thematic context, how can you be self-actualized in a form where your hair color is different? How can one honestly embrace oneself in a form that doesn't actually look like oneself? If this is actually meant to be Ichigo in his ultimate form and true identity, why is it so removed from who he actually is? Clearly more work needed to be done for him to understand himself and gain a better idea of who he was, what he wanted to do, and how to approach that. And that is why Fullbring was so essential. I won't go into a full discussion of the arc as that's something I already did in my video on it, but the defining element here is the ideological conflict between Ginjo and Ichigo. Ginjo is a total and complete foil to Ichigo, one of my favorite antagonists in the story, and all that he does completely strips Ichigo down to allow for him to understand who he truly is to put himself together again. After Ichigo is deprived of a Soul Reaper's ability to protect others which causes him to feel lost, Ginjo then deprives him of those he desires to protect. And he subsequently poses a question to Ichigo, showing him the corruption of the Soul Society and imploring to him, "Don't you wish to despair and burn it all to cinders?" And Ichigo does not criticize him for feeling this way, as he believes it to be valid, but he just chooses to interpret things differently, and communicates while embracing Ginjo's heartache that nonetheless, he chooses to believe in people and to have hope. And in addition, we see that in his heart and soul, he is a Soul Reaper, and more importantly, all that it entails. He is saved by the connections he's fostered as a result of being exactly who he is, the greatest example that he's worth so much. But in spite of these gigantic steps, we're still not quite there yet. In his greatest test in the series, during the 1,000-year Blood War, Yhwach postures the topic of Ichigo's existence as a nebulous, formless thing unable to be independently defined. Ichigo then takes on a cruel burden once again to save the Soul Society. He suffers defeat and agony again. But through all of this, he comes to learn exactly how he was born through witnessing the miracle that led to his birth and the formation of who he is. Masaki's love and messages to her beloved son filter through White and Old Man Zangetsu, protecting his mind and heart while encouraging him to be all that he can be. And Ichigo finds himself at the precipice, finally capable of being able to accept it all as an abstract form of a mother's love, and finally capable of understanding that he is worthy of love, internally and externally, and he embraces it all. But even still, that doesn't mean he's perfect and fully formed, because life is a constant battle and Ichigo's goal is one that is never finished. But the key distinction is that while this struggle was exclusively arduous and painful before, now it's tinged with hope and love and confidence and peace. He suffers total and complete defeat against Yhwach, a regression, but then is reminded of his bonds and who he has connected with and protected, and this allows him to keep going and defeat Yhwach, not on his own, but through embracing the help of others rather than alienating them to selfishly protect them. It's something he never considered before, with what used to be a weakness now turning into his strength. And with a brand new outlook, life goes on. Now, I don't think that I've said anything novel in this video that hasn't been said before, but more than anything, I think I want to get across how wonderfully real the construction of Ichigo's arc is and how applicable it is to genuine real-life struggles. There have been so many times in my life where I felt defeated, anxious, and desperate, and there will continue to be those moments. It's so easy to be consumed by that despair, and some stories will tell you to keep pushing to not allow yourself to feel that despair. And that is valid, but I admire Bleach's insistence on having Ichigo constantly feel despair and defeat without being able to be optimistic in the moment. He would not be able to be where he is without others and a bit of luck, but those opportunities lined up because of him never failing to show his honest, heartfelt care. Even if it was in a flawed way, the message came across to those who mattered. Every mistake and regression that Ichigo felt, every defeat that had him questioning whether living was even worth it, every backward step, they were all their own form of progress. They were perfect in their imperfection, because it simply isn't possible for a human being to be able to persevere and not ever despair. And that's okay, because it's all part of the journey. Ichigo is constantly evolving and evolving. His fights always give him something to learn, in both defeat and victory. Some defeats are extremely beneficial, some victories hollow, but there is always something to learn from them that accumulates in his mind. Despite not valuing himself, he has a purity of soul, an empathy and understanding, and a beating hopeful heart that others can't help but gravitate to, in-universe and out. And that is why Ichigo embracing and accepting Masaki's love, feeling her warmth and realizing upon doing so that he is worth loving, is so important and life-affirming. It made me proud of him. More than most other characters that I've ever seen, Ichigo's journey is far from straightforward. There are peaks and valleys and steps forward and steps back. It's ugly and messy, but that's life, and any other approach would have been disloyal to the profound difficulty of what he was going through. Bleach is many things. A championing of courage and conviction, a celebration and contemplation of the nature of stories, an examination of the facets of contemporary battle shonen, and more. But chief among those is that it's an abstract reflection and mirror of Ichigo Kurosaki and the disparate elements within him that coalesce in the most important moment in the series, with everything about it being so essential in displaying his growth and battles. It is so heartfelt that it makes me emotional, and it is so real that it not only makes Bleach one of the most emotionally captivating works out there, but it gives me encouragement in my own life to never give up the endless battle of understanding and loving myself. Many thanks for watching.